I walked through our front door at 6:47 a.m., still wearing yesterday's bridesmaid dress from my sister's rehearsal dinner, expecting to find my fiancé David nervous and excited about our wedding ceremony that was supposed to start in exactly 4 hours. Instead, I found silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong in your bones, like walking into a house where all the clocks have stopped at once. The first thing I noticed was his wedding suit hanging on the bathroom door, untouched. The second thing was the envelope on our kitchen counter with my name written in his careful handwriting. The third thing was the absence of everything that made David himself. His cologne wasn't lingering in the air. His coffee mug wasn't in the sink. His keys weren't hanging on the hook by the door. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My hands shook as I reached for the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with words that would change everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and the man I'd planned to marry. The letter started with an apology and ended with goodbye forever, explaining that he couldn't go through with the wedding because he'd been living a lie for 3 years. He wrote about debts I'd never heard of, relationships I'd never suspected, and a life he'd been hiding behind the smile that had made me fall in love with him in the first place. I read those words 3 times before they started making sense. David was gone. Our wedding was in 4 hours. 200 guests were probably already getting dressed, preparing to celebrate what they thought was going to be the happiest day of my life. My mother had spent the last 6 months planning every detail, from the hand-calligraphed place cards to the imported French champagne she'd insisted we needed for the toast. My father had taken time off work for the first time in 5 years to walk me down the aisle of the same church where he'd married my mother 32 years ago. The worst part wasn't even the abandonment itself. It was the realization that everything I thought I knew about our relationship had been carefully constructed fiction. David had been my college sweetheart, the steady presence who'd helped me through my mother's cancer treatments, the man who'd proposed on the beach where we'd had our first date. He'd spent 3 years building a life with me while apparently planning his escape the entire time. I sat on our kitchen floor, still in my wrinkled purple bridesmaid dress, holding a suicide note that wasn't actually about suicide at all. It was about cowardice disguised as tragedy, abandonment dressed up as sacrifice. He'd written about how much he loved me, how I deserved better than what he could give me, how this was the only way to set me free. But between the lines, I could read the truth. This wasn't about protecting me. This was about protecting himself from facing the consequences of choices he'd been making behind my back for months, maybe years. My phone started ringing at 7:15. The first call was from my maid of honor, Jessica, asking if I needed her to come over early to help with last-minute preparations. I let it go to voicemail. The second call was from the florist, confirming delivery time for the bridal bouquet. The third was from my mother, her voice bright with excitement as she talked about how beautiful the church looked with all the decorations in place. I couldn't answer any of them. How do you tell people that the wedding they've been preparing for months to celebrate isn't going to happen because the groom has disappeared with a note claiming he's dead? How do you explain that the man everyone thought they knew had been living a double life that none of us had suspected? Instead, I walked through our apartment like I was seeing it for the first time. Everything looked different now that I knew it had all been temporary in his mind. The framed photos of us on vacation looked like evidence of elaborate deception. The books he'd been reading seemed like props in a performance I hadn't realized I was watching. Even our coffee maker, which he'd insisted we register for because he loved making breakfast on Sunday mornings, felt like part of an elaborate lie designed to make me believe in a future he'd never intended to share. David had always been good at details. It was one of the things I'd loved about him. He remembered anniversaries, birthdays, the names of my co-workers' children, the specific way I liked my tea prepared. Now I understood that attention to detail differently. He hadn't been caring, he'd been careful. Every gesture, every memory, every moment of apparent intimacy had been calculated to maintain the illusion that he was the man he was pretending to be. The apartment we'd shared for 2 years was filled with evidence of his methodical deception. His clothes were gone from the closet, but he'd left behind everything we'd bought together. The throw pillows we'd picked out during a weekend trip to Portland. The dining table we'd found at an estate sale and refinished together in our building's basement. The expensive espresso machine his parents had given us for Christmas last year. He'd taken nothing that would remind him of me but left everything that would remind me of the life I'd thought we were building. I found myself checking his note again, looking for clues I might have missed on the first 3 readings. The handwriting was definitely his, neat block letters that I'd seen on shopping lists and birthday cards for years. But the words felt strange, like they'd been written by someone imitating David rather than David himself. The phrasing was too formal, too distant. He'd called me Dear Sarah, instead of the sweetheart he'd used in every other letter he'd ever written me. That's when I started noticing other things that didn't make sense. His laptop was gone, but the charger was still plugged into the wall. His bathroom products were missing, but he'd left behind the expensive cologne I'd given him for his birthday just 2 months ago. His passport wasn't in the drawer where we'd always kept our important documents together, but his birth certificate and social security card were still there. The more I looked around, the more it became clear that David hadn't killed himself. He'd run away. And he'd been planning this escape for a long time. My phone rang again at 8:30. This time it was my father, calling to check if I needed anything before he left his hotel to come pick me up for photos at the church. His voice was warm and proud, the way it always got when he talked about important family moments. I could hear my mother in the background asking if I'd eaten breakfast, reminding him to tell me that the weather was going to be perfect for outdoor photos after the ceremony. I still couldn't answer. How do you tell your parents that their daughter's wedding day has become the day she discovered her entire relationship was built on lies? How do you explain that the man they'd welcomed into the family, the man they'd toasted at dinner parties and invited to holiday celebrations, had never really existed at all? Instead, I started going through David's things more systematically. I'd never snooped before because I'd never had reason to doubt him. We'd shared passwords and bank accounts and future plans with the easy trust of people who believed they were building something permanent together. Now I was looking for evidence of the deception I'd been too trusting to notice. In his desk drawer behind a stack of work documents, I found a prepaid cell phone I'd never seen before. It was an old model, the kind people buy when they need a number that can't be traced back to them easily. The call history showed dozens of numbers I didn't recognize, with conversations that had been happening for months. The text messages were mostly deleted, but a few remained in the drafts folder, messages that had never been sent. One draft message read, "Everything is set for Saturday morning. Sarah will be at her sister's until late Friday night. That gives us the window we need." Another said, "The bank transfer went through. Account will be closed by Monday morning." A third was even more damning, "Can't wait to start over somewhere nobody knows us." He wasn't running away alone. The revelation hit me like cold water. David hadn't just been lying about money or debts or whatever problems he'd mentioned in his note. He'd been lying about everything, including his feelings for me. Somewhere in his secret life was another woman, someone he was choosing over the 3 years we'd spent together, someone who knew about me but had been helping him plan his escape anyway. I sat back down on the kitchen floor, still holding the phone that contained evidence of betrayal I hadn't even suspected. The suicide note on the counter wasn't a confession or an apology, it was misdirection, designed to make me waste time grieving instead of looking for answers. While I was supposed to be crying over his tragic sacrifice, he was probably already on a plane to whatever new life he'd been planning with whoever had been helping him disappear. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "OMG, the church looks incredible. Can't wait to see you in your dress. Should I come help with makeup?" She'd attached a photo of the altar decorated with white roses and greenery, the same arrangement my mother and I had spent hours planning with the wedding coordinator. Everything looked exactly like the fairy tale wedding I'd dreamed about since I was little, except the groom had turned out to be more of a villain than a prince. That's when the anger started, not the hot, explosive kind of anger that makes you throw things or scream at walls. The cold, calculating kind of anger that makes you start thinking strategically about what comes next. David thought he was clever, disappearing with a dramatic note designed to make me feel sorry for him instead of suspicious of him. He thought I'd be too devastated to ask questions, too heartbroken to investigate, too trusting to doubt his carefully constructed final performance. He had no idea what he'd just awakened. I'd always been the kind of person who took care of details. In college, I was the friend who organized group projects and made sure everyone met their deadlines. At work, I was the marketing coordinator who tracked 18 different campaigns simultaneously and never missed a deliverable. In our relationship, I was the person who managed our calendar, our finances, our social commitments, our future plans. David had always joked that I was the most organized person he'd ever met, but now I realized he'd been counting on that organizational skill working in his favor. He expected me to efficiently cancel our wedding, clean up his mess, and quietly disappear from his story, so he could start fresh with whoever had been helping him plan this betrayal. What he didn't expect was that those same organizational skills could be turned toward figuring out exactly what he'd been hiding and why he'd chosen to destroy our life together, in the most cowardly way possible. I started by making a list, the same way I approached any complex project at work. First, I needed to understand the scope of his deception. How long had he been planning this? How much money was involved? Who was the other woman? Where did he go? What did he take with him? What evidence had he left behind? Second, I needed to manage the immediate crisis. 200 wedding guests were expecting to celebrate in 3 hours. My family had spent thousands of dollars on a celebration that wasn't going to happen. Vendors needed to be notified, deposits needed to be recovered if possible, and everyone who loved me needed to understand what had happened without making me relive the humiliation over and over again. Third, I needed to protect myself legally and financially. If David had been hiding debts or obligations, I needed to make sure his problems didn't become my problems. If he'd been stealing from our shared accounts or using my information for anything fraudulent, I needed to document everything and report it properly. Fourth, and most importantly, I needed to make sure he faced consequences for what he'd done. Not just to me, but to everyone who'd trusted him, supported our relationship, and invested in our future together. David had calculated that disappearing would be easier than facing the mess he'd created, but he'd made that calculation based on the assumption that I'd be too broken to fight back. He was wrong about that. I took a shower and put on jeans and a sweater, hanging the bridesmaid dress in the back of my closet where I wouldn't have to look at it anymore. Then I sat down at my laptop and started documenting everything I'd discovered, taking photos of the prepaid phone, screenshots of the deleted messages, pictures of the things he'd taken, and the things he'd left behind. If David wanted to play games with disappearing acts and fake suicide notes, I was going to make sure there was a permanent record of exactly what kind of person he really was. My phone rang again at 9:45. This time it was the church coordinator, asking if we needed any last-minute adjustments to the ceremony timeline. Her voice was cheerful and professional, the tone of someone who'd helped hundreds of couples celebrate the happiest day of their lives. I finally answered. "This is Sarah," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I need to let you know that the wedding has been canceled. The groom won't be attending." There was a long pause. "Oh my goodness, is everything all right? Is someone sick? Do we need to postpone?" "No," I said, "we need to cancel completely. I'll be there in an hour to speak with everyone and handle the logistics." "Sarah, I'm so sorry. What can I do to help?" "Just please don't let anyone start the ceremony until I get there to explain the situation." After I hung up, I called Jessica and asked her to meet me at the church. I didn't explain everything over the phone, just told her there was an emergency and I needed her support for something difficult. Jessica had been my best friend since sophomore year of college. She'd been the one who'd introduced me to David at a party where he'd been charming and funny and seemingly perfect. She'd been my maid of honor because she'd believed in our relationship as much as I had. Now she was going to have to help me tell 200 people that the wedding they'd come to celebrate was based on 3 years of elaborate lies. I drove to the church with David's suicide note in my purse and photos of his secret phone on my camera roll. The morning was beautiful, exactly the kind of perfect spring day I'd always imagined for my wedding. The sun was bright without being too hot. There was just enough breeze to make the trees dance, and the church looked like something from a magazine with all the white flowers and elegant decorations my mother had spent months coordinating. Cars were already starting to arrive in the parking lot. I could see my aunts and uncles getting out of their rental car, dressed in their best clothes and carrying wrapped gifts. David's co-workers were walking toward the church entrance, laughing about something and adjusting their ties.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My grandmother was being helped out of my cousin's car, wearing the blue dress she'd bought specifically for this occasion because she'd said it matched her eyes and she wanted to look beautiful in the wedding photos. All of these people had rearranged their schedules, traveled from other cities, bought new outfits, and prepared to celebrate what they thought was going to be one of the happiest days of our lives. They had no idea they were about to witness the most humiliating moment of mine. I sat in my car for a few minutes, watching guests arrive and trying to find the right words to explain what had happened. How do you tell people that the person they thought they knew had been an elaborate fiction? How do you admit that you'd been so completely deceived, that you'd planned to marry someone who didn't actually exist? Jessica knocked on my car window at 10:30, her face worried and confused. She was wearing the purple dress we'd chosen for the bridesmaids, her hair styled the way we'd practiced during our trial run with the salon last week. She looked ready to walk down the aisle and stand beside me while I promised to love David forever, which made what I had to tell her even harder. "Sarah, what's going on? People are asking where you are. Your mom is starting to panic." I handed her David's note through the car window. "Read this." She scanned the page quickly, her expression changing from confusion to shock to anger in the space of about 30 seconds. "What the hell is this supposed to mean? Where is he? Gone. With someone else. This whole thing has been a lie." Jessica stared at me like I'd told her the sun had decided to set in the east. "That's impossible. David loves you. I've seen him with you for 3 years. This has to be some kind of mistake." I showed her the photos from the prepaid phone, the deleted messages about starting over somewhere new, the evidence that he'd been planning this disappearance for months. Jessica read everything twice, her face getting paler with each detail. "Oh my God, Sarah. I'm so sorry. What do you want to do?" "I want to go inside and tell everyone what happened before they waste any more time getting ready for a wedding that was never going to happen." We walked into the church together, Jessica's hand on my arm for support. The sanctuary was already half full of guests, and I could see my mother near the altar arranging flowers with the coordinator. She looked beautiful and proud, and completely unaware that her daughter's perfect wedding day was about to become a disaster she'd never forget. My father was in the front row, adjusting his tie and checking his watch. He'd probably been up since 5 a.m., making sure everything was perfect for the moment when he'd walk me down the aisle and give me away to the man he'd grown to love like a son. David had been included in every family gathering for 3 years. He'd helped my father fix the deck last summer. He'd driven my mother to chemotherapy appointments when I couldn't get off work. He'd become part of our family in ways that went far beyond just being my boyfriend. Now I had to tell them that the person they'd welcomed into their lives with such trust and affection had been using that trust to plan his escape from all of us. The church coordinator approached me as soon as she saw me walk in. "Sarah, thank goodness you're here. Is everything ready? We have guests arriving, but we haven't seen David yet." "That's what I need to talk to everyone about," I said. "Can you ask people to take their seats? I need to make an announcement." She looked confused but nodded, walking to the front of the church to get everyone's attention. I watched 200 faces turn toward me expectantly, all of them dressed up and happy and ready to celebrate. My grandmother waved at me from the third row. David's parents, who'd flown in from Seattle, smiled encouragingly from their seats on the groom's side of the church. I walked to the front and stood where I was supposed to have stood in an hour to say my wedding vows. Instead, I was about to deliver the hardest speech of my life. "Thank you all for being here today," I began, my voice somehow steady despite everything. "I know you came here expecting to witness a wedding, and I'm grateful for all the love and support you've shown David and me over the past 3 years." I could see confusion starting to spread across faces in the congregation.
My mother had stopped arranging flowers and was staring at me with growing alarm. Unfortunately, I need to let you know that there won't be a wedding today. David left this morning and won't be returning. He's decided to end our relationship and start a new life elsewhere. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. 200 people trying to process information that didn't make sense, trying to understand how a wedding could be canceled an hour before it was supposed to start, trying to figure out what they were supposed to do with all the celebration they'd prepared to give us. My mother reached me first, her face white with shock and confusion. "Sarah, what are you talking about? Where is David? Is he sick? Did something happen?" I handed her the note, watching her read the same words that had changed everything for me just 3 hours earlier. Her expression shifted from confusion to understanding to fury in the space of a few seconds. "That coward," she whispered, loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "That absolute coward." David's parents approached next, looking bewildered and embarrassed. "Sarah, we don't understand." David was excited about today. He called us yesterday to tell us how happy he was. "This doesn't make any sense." "It doesn't make sense to me either," I admitted, "but he's gone and he's not coming back." What happened next was something I hadn't expected. Instead of awkward departures and whispered conversations about how embarrassing this all was, people rallied around me. My father put his arm around my shoulders and announced that anyone who wanted to stay for lunch was welcome, that we had food and music and flowers, and there was no reason the people who loved me couldn't spend the day celebrating friendship instead of marriage. My aunts started moving flowers from the altar to the reception tables. My cousins began helping my mother coordinate with the caterers about serving lunch instead of a wedding reception. David's co-workers, who barely knew me but had come to support what they thought was his happy day, stayed to offer their condolences and tell me stories about how he'd talked about me at work. Even David's parents stayed, apologizing over and over for their son's behavior and insisting that they had no idea he'd been planning anything like this. His mother cried actual tears, telling me I'd been the best thing that had ever happened to him, and she couldn't understand how he could throw away something so good. But the most unexpected response came from David's sister Emma, who'd flown in from Portland to be part of our wedding. She approached me during what should have been our reception, holding a glass of champagne and looking angrier than I'd ever seen her. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," she said quietly. "David called me last week asking about inheritance laws and asset protection. I thought it was weird because you guys always seemed so stable financially, but he said he was just being cautious about protecting your future together." She paused, looking around to make sure no one else was listening. "Now I think he was trying to figure out how to take money without you being able to trace it or get it back. And there's something else." Emma pulled out her phone and showed me a photo from her Instagram account. It was from a bar in Portland taken 2 months ago when David had supposedly been there on a business trip. In the background of the photo, clearly visible even though he'd probably thought he was hidden, was David sitting at a corner table with a woman I'd never seen before. They were holding hands and leaning toward each other in a way that made their relationship obvious to anyone looking. I didn't think anything of it at the time because I figured you knew he was meeting an old friend or something. Emma said, "But looking at it now, with everything that's happened today, I think this might be who he left with." I stared at the photo, finally seeing the face of the person who'd been helping David plan his escape from our life together. She was younger than me, with long blonde hair and the kind of confident smile that belonged to someone who'd never doubted she could take whatever she wanted from whoever had it first. She was wearing expensive clothes and jewelry that didn't match the kind of salary David made at his marketing job. "Do you know who she is?" I asked Emma. "No, but I can find out. I know people in Portland who might recognize her." That's when I realized David's betrayal was even bigger than I'd initially understood. This wasn't just about him getting cold feet or having an affair. This was about him systematically planning to steal from me, disappear with someone else, and leave me to deal with the consequences of whatever mess he'd created in his hidden life. He'd underestimated me in every possible way. He thought I'd be too heartbroken to investigate, too embarrassed to ask questions, too trusting to demand answers. He thought he could vanish into his new life, while I quietly cleaned up behind him and eventually moved on with some other man who would hopefully be more honest than he'd been. What David didn't understand was that I'd spent 3 years learning to love someone who turned out to be an expert liar. That meant I'd also spent 3 years learning from an expert liar, watching him construct elaborate deceptions without even realizing I was getting an education in manipulation and strategic thinking. Now I was going to use everything he'd accidentally taught me to make sure he faced consequences for what he'd done to me, to our families, and to everyone who trusted him enough to believe in our future together. The reception that should have been our wedding celebration became the launch party for the most important project of my life. By the end of the afternoon, I had a dozen people volunteering to help me track down information about David's disappearance, his financial activities, and the woman who'd been helping him plan his escape. My father, who worked in corporate security, offered to help me trace his digital footprint. My cousin Mike, who was a private investigator, volunteered to look into the mystery woman's identity. Jessica's brother, who worked in banking, explained how to protect my accounts and trace any suspicious transactions. Even David's family wanted to help. His parents were mortified that their son had turned out to be the kind of person who would abandon someone at the altar, and they offered to share any information they had about his recent activities or changes in behavior. By evening, I had a team of people working to uncover the truth about David's secret life, and I had a clear understanding of what I needed to do next. This wasn't just about getting closure or understanding why he'd left. This was about making sure he couldn't do this to anyone else, and making sure the people who'd invested in our relationship didn't lose everything they'd given us without getting some kind of justice in return. David thought he'd destroyed my life by disappearing with his fake suicide note and his secret girlfriend. Instead, he'd given me a purpose that was bigger than any wedding could have been. He'd turned me into someone who wasn't going to be satisfied with just moving on and forgetting what had happened. He'd created an opponent he hadn't expected, and he had no idea what was coming for him. The week after the wedding that never happened, I moved through my life like an actress playing a role I'd never auditioned for. People at work spoke to me in gentle voices, the way you talk to someone recovering from surgery. My supervisor offered me bereavement leave, even though technically no one had died. The barista at my usual coffee shop gave me extra foam hearts in my latte, and refused to let me pay. Everyone was being kind in the way people are, when they don't know what else to do with someone else's catastrophe. But while everyone else was treating me like a victim, I was systematically dismantling David's carefully constructed lies piece by piece. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. On Tuesday morning, I received a call from someone who introduced herself as Margaret Chen, David's landlord from 2 years ago, before we'd moved in together. She'd seen the news coverage of our canceled wedding in the local paper and wanted to reach out. "I hope you don't mind me calling," she said, her voice hesitant. "I probably should have said something earlier, but I wasn't sure if it was my place. But after seeing what happened to you, I feel terrible for staying quiet." Margaret explained that David had rented a studio apartment from her even after we'd officially moved in together. He'd told her it was for work projects that required quiet space, somewhere he could focus on important presentations without distraction. She'd thought it was unusual but hadn't questioned it since he'd always paid rent on time and kept the place clean. "The thing is," she continued, "he had mail delivered there under a different name. David Mitchell instead of David Morrison, and there were often packages, expensive-looking ones. I always wondered why someone would need a separate apartment just for work, but he seemed like such a nice young man." I asked her if the apartment was still rented, knowing the answer before she spoke. "That's why I'm calling. He came by Saturday morning very early, maybe 6 a.m., and cleaned everything out. Took boxes and boxes of things to his car. Said his work project was finished and he wouldn't be needing the space anymore. Left the keys and 2 months advance rent, which was strange because his lease wasn't up until September. Saturday morning, while I was discovering his note and trying to understand what had happened, David had been methodically clearing out a secret apartment I'd never known existed. While I was calling off our wedding and explaining to 200 guests why the groom wouldn't be attending, he'd been erasing evidence of whatever he'd been doing in that studio for 2 years. Margaret gave me the address, and I drove there during my lunch break on Wednesday. The building was downtown, about 15 minutes from our shared apartment, in a neighborhood I rarely visited. It was an older brick building with small units that seemed designed for people who needed space but not luxury. The kind of place where someone could disappear into anonymity if they wanted to. I walked up to the third floor and stood outside what had been David's secret space. The door was painted green, and there was a small window that looked out onto the fire escape. I tried to imagine him climbing those stairs twice a week, or however often he'd come here, carrying on some part of his life that he'd never mentioned to me. For 2 years, while I'd thought we were sharing everything, he'd been maintaining an entire separate existence, just 15 minutes from our bed. The superintendent, an elderly man named Frank, was replacing a light fixture in the hallway. When I explained who I was, his expression shifted from polite curiosity to something that looked like pity mixed with anger.
"You're the girl who was supposed to marry that Morrison fellow," he said, setting down his toolbox. "I saw the news about your wedding getting called off. I'm real sorry about that, thank you. I was wondering if you might remember anything unusual about David's time here." His former landlord said he moved out Saturday morning. Frank looked around the hallway as if checking for eavesdroppers, then lowered his voice. "Look, I probably shouldn't say this, but that guy was bad news. Always felt wrong to me, the way he came and went at weird hours, always looking over his shoulder like he was expecting trouble." He paused, seeming to wrestle with how much to share. "And there was the woman. Pretty blonde thing, maybe 25, drove a fancy red car. Started showing up about 6 months ago, sometimes staying overnight. Wouldn't have been my business, except she was loud, you know, laughing and carrying on at all hours, playing music too loud, making the other tenants complain." Frank described someone who matched the woman from Emma's photograph exactly. Blonde hair, confident demeanor, expensive taste in clothes and cars. She'd been visiting David's secret apartment for months, while he was living with me, planning our wedding and discussing our future together. "The weird thing was how nervous he got about her being here," Frank continued. "Usually tenants who have guests don't care what anybody thinks, but Morrison was always asking me not to mention her to anyone, offering me extra money to keep quiet about her visits. Made me wonder what kind of trouble they were mixed up in." I thanked Frank and walked back to my car, my mind racing with the implications of what I'd learned. David hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been maintaining an entire parallel life, complete with a different identity and a secret residence where he could conduct whatever business he'd been hiding from me. The blonde woman wasn't just his escape plan, she'd been his partner in deception for at least 6 months, maybe longer. That evening, I called Mike, my cousin who worked as a private investigator. He'd volunteered to help track down information about David's disappearance, and I was ready to take him up on the offer. "I need you to find out everything you can about someone named David Mitchell," I told him, explaining about the secret apartment and the alternate identity. Same person as David Morrison, but he's been using Mitchell for something he didn't want traced back to his real name. Mike was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, that kind of thing usually means someone's involved in activities they shouldn't be. Identity fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, sometimes worse. Are you sure you want to know what we might find?" "I'm sure. Whatever he was doing, I need to understand the scope of it, and I need to make sure it doesn't come back to hurt me or anyone else he's lied to." Mike agreed to start investigating the next day. He had contacts in banking, credit reporting, and public records who could trace financial activity under both names. He also knew people in law enforcement who might be able to check if David had any outstanding warrants or legal troubles I wasn't aware of. While Mike began his professional investigation, I started my own amateur detective work. I created a timeline of David's behavior over the past year, marking every business trip, every late night at work, every weekend when he'd disappeared for a few hours to run errands that had seemed perfectly normal at the time. Now I was looking for patterns that might reveal when he'd been visiting his secret apartment or meeting with his blonde accomplice. The pattern that emerged was more disturbing than I'd expected. David's absences had been systematic and regular, usually twice a week on Tuesday and Thursday evenings when he'd claimed to be working late or going to the gym. Saturday mornings when he'd said he was meeting college friends for breakfast. Sunday afternoons when he'd told me he was visiting his elderly neighbor who needed help with yard work. Every lie had been small enough to seem believable, considerate enough to make him look like a good person, and consistent enough to create a reliable schedule for his secret activities.
He'd been living a double life with the same methodical planning he'd brought to our relationship, treating deception like a project that required careful time management and attention to detail. I also started going through our shared financial records more carefully than I'd ever done before. David had always handled most of our banking, claiming he was better with numbers and enjoyed managing our budget. I'd trusted him completely, only checking our accounts occasionally, to verify that my automatic deposits were going through properly. Now I discovered that our joint savings account, which should have contained nearly $15,000 from 3 years of careful budgeting for our future, had been systematically drained over the past 8 months. Small withdrawals that individually looked like normal expenses but together added up to most of our shared financial security. David had been stealing from our future to fund whatever he'd been doing in his secret life. The withdrawals followed the same pattern as his mysterious absences. $200 or $300 every Tuesday and Thursday, larger amounts on weekends, always with explanations that had seemed reasonable at the time. Car repairs, gifts for family members, work expenses that would be reimbursed later, emergency loans to friends who were temporarily short on cash. I'd believed every explanation because I'd had no reason to doubt him. David had been my partner, my future husband, the person I'd trusted with my heart and my financial security. The idea that he might be systematically stealing from me while planning our wedding had been literally unthinkable. But the evidence was clear in black and white across 8 months of bank statements. David had been funding his escape plan with money we'd saved together for our shared future. Every dollar I'd contributed to our life together had become a resource for him to use in abandoning that life for someone else. On Friday, Mike called with his preliminary findings about David Mitchell. "Sarah, you need to sit down for this. Your ex-fiancé has been living more than a double life. He's been living a triple life." Mike had discovered that David Mitchell had credit cards, a bank account, and a registered business address at the downtown apartment. The business was listed as Mitchell Consulting Services, described as providing marketing advice to small businesses. But the financial activity suggested something much more complex than simple consulting. "There are deposits from at least a dozen different sources over the past year," Mike explained. "Some of them are small businesses, which would make sense for consulting work. But others are individuals, and the amounts are weird, not what you'd expect someone to pay for marketing advice." The deposits ranged from $500 to $3,000, usually paid monthly by the same people for several months at a time. Some clients had been paying David Mitchell for over a year, which meant he'd been running this secret business almost since we'd gotten engaged. "What kind of consulting work requires monthly payments like that?" I asked. "That's what worries me," Mike said. "Those payment patterns look more like blackmail or protection money than legitimate business income. People paying regularly to keep someone quiet about something they don't want exposed." The possibility that David had been blackmailing people while pretending to love me was so shocking I couldn't immediately process it. I'd thought the worst-case scenario was that he'd been having an affair and stealing money to fund his escape. The idea that he might have been systematically extorting money from multiple victims while planning our wedding was beyond anything I'd imagined. "There's more," Mike continued. "David Mitchell has been building credit under that name for 2 years. He's got a car loan, several credit cards, and he just took out a substantial personal loan last month. Whatever he's planning to do with his new life, he's been preparing financially for a long time." Mike sent me digital copies of everything he'd found, and I spent the weekend studying David's secret financial empire. The scope of his deception was breathtaking. He hadn't just been cheating on me or stealing from our shared accounts. He'd been running a sophisticated operation that involved multiple identities, multiple income streams, and what appeared to be systematic exploitation of people who'd trusted him with sensitive information. The business address led me to more questions. Mitchell Consulting Services was registered at the apartment building, but David had been receiving mail there under his real name as well. That meant he'd been mixing his legitimate identity with his false one, creating a web of lies that connected his official life with his secret activities. I started researching the people and businesses that had been paying David Mitchell. Many of the individual names didn't turn up anything in basic internet searches, but several of the businesses were local companies I recognized. A family restaurant where David and I had eaten dinner several times. A dental practice where one of my coworkers was a patient. A small accounting firm that handled taxes for several people I knew. The pattern suggested that David had been targeting people and businesses in our own community, using information he'd gathered through our social connections to identify vulnerable targets for whatever scheme he'd been running. He'd been weaponizing our shared life, turning our friends and neighbors into victims of his secret operation. That realization was what finally broke through my shock and activated my anger. David hadn't just betrayed me personally. He'd been using our relationship as cover for criminal activity that affected people I cared about. Every dinner party we'd attended, every community event where we'd mingled with neighbors, every social gathering where I'd introduced him to my friends and colleagues had been reconnaissance for him. I'd unknowingly been helping him identify targets for blackmail or fraud while believing we were building social connections as a couple. My trust, my reputation, my genuine affection for our community had all been tools in his criminal enterprise. On Sunday evening, I called a meeting with the group of people who'd volunteered to help me investigate David's disappearance. My father, Mike, Jessica, Emma, and even David's parents gathered in my living room to review what we'd discovered so far. I laid out everything methodically, the way I'd learned to present complex projects at work. The secret apartment and false identity. The systematic theft from our shared accounts. The suspicious business income that looked like extortion payments. The pattern of lies that had allowed him to maintain multiple lives simultaneously while none of us suspected anything. This isn't just about him running away with another woman, I concluded. David has been running a criminal operation, and he's been using all of us as unwitting accomplices. He met his victims through our social connections. He funded his operation by stealing from our shared savings. He maintained his cover by appearing to be a devoted fiancé planning a traditional wedding. David's father looked like he'd aged 10 years during my presentation. "I can't believe we raised someone capable of this," he said quietly. "How did we not see what kind of person he was becoming?" "He didn't want us to see," I replied. "This level of deception requires incredible skill and planning. David is obviously much more intelligent and manipulative than any of us realized." Emma had been taking notes throughout my presentation. "What do we do now? Do we call the police? Can we track him down somehow?" "We're going to do both," I said. "But first, we need to understand the full scope of what he's done. If David has been blackmailing people, there might be victims who are afraid to come forward. If he's been running financial scams, there might be evidence we can gather to help law enforcement build a case." My father, whose experience in corporate security had taught him about white-collar crime, agreed that we needed to move carefully. If David has been as methodical about his criminal activities as he was about maintaining his false identities, he's probably covered his tracks pretty well. We need to be smarter than he's been if we want to catch him. Jessica raised her hand like we were in a classroom. "What about the blonde woman? If she's been helping him, she might know where he went or what he's planning next." "That's our most promising lead," I agreed. "Emma, do you think your friends in Portland might be able to identify her from the photograph?" "I've already sent the picture to 3 people who know the Portland social scene pretty well," Emma said. "One of them thinks she recognizes her, but wants to check with some other people before saying anything definitive." Mike had been quiet throughout most of the meeting, but now he leaned forward with the expression he got when he was about to share something important. "Sarah, there's something else we need to consider. If David has been blackmailing people, and if those people find out he's disappeared, they might come looking for him. And they might start with you." The room went quiet as everyone processed what Mike was suggesting. If David's victims didn't know about his secret life, they might assume I'd been part of his operation. If they'd been paying him to keep quiet about something embarrassing or illegal, they might think I had access to whatever information he'd been using against them. "You mean people might think I was involved in whatever David was doing?" I asked. "Or they might think you have access to his files, his records, whatever evidence he was using to extort money from them." Mike replied, "You need to be very careful about your personal security until we understand what kind of people David was dealing with." That possibility hadn't occurred to me, but it made perfect sense. If David had been running a blackmail operation, his victims would be desperate to recover any evidence he might have gathered about their secrets. They wouldn't necessarily know or care that his fiancé had been as deceived as everyone else. David's mother suggested I stay with them until we knew more about the situation, but I declined. Running away or hiding would only make me look more suspicious if anyone was actually watching me. Instead, I was going to continue my investigation while taking reasonable precautions about my safety. What I need from all of you, I told the group, is help gathering information about David's activities over the past 2 years. Any strange conversations you remember, any unusual requests he made, any behavior that seemed odd at the time but didn't seem important enough to mention. I'll also need help approaching the people and businesses that were paying David Mitchell. Some of them might be victims who deserve to know what happened to their money. Others might be accomplices who were helping him run his operation. Over the next hour, we divided up responsibilities for the investigation.
Mike would continue tracking David's financial activities and try to identify the woman from Emma's photograph. My father would review security camera footage from David's apartment building and the downtown location where he'd been running his fake business. Jessica would help me contact the local businesses that had been paying Mitchell consulting services. Emma and David's parents would reach out to friends and family members who might have information about David's recent behavior or travel plans. Everyone agreed to document anything suspicious and report back to the group within a week. As people prepared to leave, Jessica pulled me aside. "Sarah, are you sure you want to keep pushing this? What if David was involved with dangerous people? What if trying to track him down puts you in danger?" I'd been asking myself the same question all week. The smart thing would probably be to report what I'd found to the police and let them handle the investigation. The safe thing would be to change my locks, close our joint accounts, and try to rebuild my life without looking backward. But I couldn't stop thinking about the people who'd been paying David Mitchell monthly fees for months or years. If he'd been blackmailing them, they were victims who deserved justice. If they'd been accomplices in his operation, they were criminals who needed to be stopped. Either way, they were part of a story that was bigger than just my personal heartbreak. "I need to see this through," I told Jessica. David used our relationship, our community, our friends and family as tools in whatever scheme he was running. He turned our love story into a criminal enterprise. I can't just walk away from that. Jessica nodded, though she still looked worried. "Just promise me you'll be careful. And promise you'll call me if anything feels dangerous or overwhelming." After everyone left, I sat in my living room surrounded by papers and photographs and bank statements that told the story of David's secret life. 3 weeks ago, I'd been planning to marry someone I thought I knew completely. Now I was uncovering evidence that the man I'd loved was a sophisticated criminal who'd been using me as an unwitting accomplice in activities I'd never suspected. The transformation was disorienting, but it was also liberating. For 3 years, I'd been trying to be the perfect fiancé for someone who'd been systematically deceiving me. I'd been accommodating his schedule, supporting his career, and planning our future together while he'd been stealing from me and using our relationship to target victims for his criminal operation. Now I was free to be someone different. Instead of being David's devoted fiancé, I could be Sarah the investigator. Sarah the problem solver, Sarah the woman who refused to be victimized by someone else's lies. I could use all the organizational skills and attention to detail that had made me good at my job to dismantle David's criminal empire piece by piece. I opened my laptop and created a new folder labeled David Investigation. Then I started organizing everything I'd learned into categories: financial evidence, false identity documentation, victim identification, timeline of criminal activities, potential accomplices and collaborators. For the first time since reading David's fake suicide note, I felt like I had a clear sense of purpose. I wasn't just trying to understand why he'd left me. I was trying to protect other people from becoming his victims and ensure that he faced consequences for what he'd already done. David had calculated that disappearing would be easier than facing the legal and personal consequences of his criminal activities. He'd assumed that I'd be too heartbroken to investigate, too trusting to doubt his cover story, and too naive to uncover the sophisticated operation he'd been running behind my back. He'd underestimated me in every possible way, and now I was going to use his mistake to make sure he couldn't hurt anyone else the way he'd hurt me and the people who'd trusted us both.
The investigation was just beginning, but I already knew how it was going to end. David thought he'd escaped to start a new life with his blonde accomplice and whatever money he'd stolen from his victims. What he didn't realize was that he'd left behind evidence of every crime he'd committed and a very angry woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain by making sure he faced justice for what he'd done. By the time I was finished with my investigation, David Morrison and David Mitchell would both be facing criminal charges, and every penny he'd stolen would be returned to the people he'd victimized. His new life with his mysterious blonde partner was going to be very short-lived, and his old life was going to catch up with him in ways he'd never anticipated. I stayed up until 3 a.m. that night, organizing evidence and planning my next steps. For the first time since David's disappearance, I felt genuinely hopeful about the future. Not because I thought he'd come back, or because I wanted him to, but because I finally understood that I was capable of much more than I'd ever given myself credit for. David had taught me, without meaning to, that I could be strategic and methodical and relentless when someone I cared about was threatened. Now I was going to use those skills to protect everyone he'd victimized, including myself, and make sure he learned that actions have consequences even when you think you've escaped them completely. 2 weeks into my investigation, Emma called with the breakthrough we'd been waiting for. Her friend in Portland had identified the blonde woman from the photograph, and the information was more valuable than I'd dared to hope. "Her name is Vivian Cross," Emma said, her voice tight with excitement and anger. "She's 26, works as a personal trainer at an upscale gym, and apparently has a reputation for targeting wealthy older men. My friend knows 3 different guys who've been involved with her, and they all have similar stories about mysterious financial problems that started after they began dating her." Emma had gathered extensive background information on Vivian through Portland's surprisingly connected social network. She lived in an expensive downtown apartment that should have been beyond her means on a trainer's salary. She drove a red BMW that was less than a year old. She wore designer clothes and carried handbags that cost more than most people's rent. More importantly, Vivian had a pattern of short-term relationships with men who had access to significant money or valuable information. She'd dated a banker who'd been mysteriously fired for policy violations 6 months after they broke up. She'd been involved with a city council member who'd resigned suddenly amid rumors about ethics investigations. She'd had a brief relationship with a tech entrepreneur whose startup had collapsed after investor information was somehow leaked to competitors. Everyone my friend talked to described the same basic situation, Emma continued. Vivian would meet these guys through mutual friends or at professional events. She'd be charming and interested and seemingly perfect. They'd date for a few months, during which time she'd learn everything about their work, their finances, their personal lives, their vulnerabilities. Then what happened? Then she'd break up with them, usually claiming she wasn't ready for something serious. But within weeks, these guys would start having problems. Missing money, leaked information, embarrassing secrets becoming public, business deals falling through for mysterious reasons. The pattern Emma described matched exactly what I'd discovered about David's activities. Vivian wasn't just David's escape plan, or even his accomplice. She was his mentor, his teacher, possibly his business partner in a sophisticated operation that targeted successful men for systematic exploitation. "Did your friend know anything about how Vivian and David met?" "Actually, yes. They met at a marketing conference in Portland about 18 months ago. David was presenting about social media strategies for small businesses, and Vivian was there as someone's guest. My friend remembers because Vivian spent the whole evening asking very specific questions about how businesses handle sensitive customer information. 18 months ago, David and I had been planning our engagement. He'd told me about that Portland conference, describing it as a valuable networking opportunity that had generated several new client prospects. He'd been excited about the connections he'd made and the potential for expanding his freelance consulting work. Now I understood that trip differently. David hadn't gone to Portland to network for legitimate business opportunities. He'd gone there to learn techniques for targeting and exploiting small business owners, and he'd met someone who could teach him everything he needed to know about sophisticated financial manipulation. Emma's information explained the timeline of David's transformation. The secret apartment had been rented 2 years ago, but his criminal activities had only begun about 18 months ago, right after the Portland conference. Vivian had recruited him into her operation, taught him her methods, and helped him establish the false identity and business front he'd needed to begin targeting victims in our community. "There's something else," Emma said. "My friend thinks Vivian might be part of a larger network. She's heard rumors about other women running similar operations in different cities, all using the same basic approach of targeting successful men through professional and social connections." The possibility that David and Vivian were part of an organized criminal network, rather than just individual operators, changed everything about my investigation. If they were connected to other criminals in other cities, finding them would be much more complicated than I'd initially assumed. But it also meant that law enforcement would be much more interested in stopping them once they understood the scope of the operation. I called Mike immediately to share Emma's discoveries. He listened without interrupting, taking notes that I could hear him scribbling on the other end of the phone. "Sarah, this is bigger than we thought," he said when I finished. "If Vivian Cross is running the kind of operation Emma described, and if she's been training David to do the same thing here, we're not just dealing with local fraud. This could be interstate organized crime." Mike explained that the FBI had task forces specifically dedicated to investigating financial crimes that crossed state boundaries. If we could demonstrate that David and Vivian had been coordinating criminal activities between Oregon and our state, federal authorities would have jurisdiction and resources that local police departments couldn't match. "But we need solid evidence," Mike continued. "Speculation and circumstantial connections won't be enough to get federal attention. We need documentation, financial records, communication between David and Vivian, proof that money was moving between their operations." I'd been thinking about the same problem. David had been careful about covering his tracks, but 18 months of criminal activity had to have left traces that could be uncovered with the right approach. The key was understanding his methods well enough to know where to look for evidence he might not have realized he was leaving behind. That evening, I drove back to David's former secret apartment building. Frank, the maintenance man who'd told me about Vivian's visits, was replacing a broken window in the lobby when I arrived. "You're back," he said, looking up from his work. "Still trying to figure out what that boyfriend of yours was up to." "Ex-boyfriend," I corrected. "And yes, I'm trying to understand what he was doing here." "Frank, you mentioned that David seemed nervous about the blonde woman's visits. Did you ever overhear any of their conversations?" Frank set down his tools and glanced around the empty lobby. "Look, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but that guy was into something he shouldn't have been. I heard them arguing once about money, about someone not paying what they owed. The woman was saying something about teaching him how to apply pressure, how to make people more motivated to cooperate." "When was this?" "Maybe 4 months ago. They were in the hallway outside his door, and I was working on the stairwell light fixture. They didn't see me, but I could hear everything they were saying." Frank described a conversation that sounded like a training session in extortion techniques. Vivian had been instructing David about timing demands for maximum psychological impact, about gathering leverage that would make victims afraid to refuse payment, about maintaining relationships that would provide ongoing access to sensitive information. The woman kept talking about documentation, about making sure everything was recorded properly, so they could prove what they knew about people. She said the key was making victims believe that paying was less risky than not paying. This was exactly the kind of evidence Mike had said we needed. Frank had overheard Vivian and David discussing criminal methodology in specific detail. If Frank would be willing to testify about what he'd heard, his testimony could help establish that their activities were coordinated and intentional rather than impulsive or accidental. "Frank, would you be willing to talk to law enforcement about what you overheard? It might be important evidence in a criminal investigation." Frank considered the question for a long moment. "You know what, yes. I've been feeling bad about not saying something sooner. When I saw in the paper what happened to your wedding, I kept thinking I should have warned you somehow. If testifying helps catch that guy, and gets justice for the people he hurt, I'm willing to do it." I thanked Frank and gave him Mike's contact information, then walked back to my car with the first piece of concrete evidence that could link David and Vivian to organized criminal activity. Frank's testimony alone wouldn't be enough to build a case, but it was a crucial first step toward documenting their operation. Over the next week, I implemented a systematic approach to gathering evidence that drew on everything I'd learned about David's methods and Vivian's background. I started by creating detailed profiles of every business and individual that had been paying David Mitchell for consulting services. The list included 12 local businesses and 8 individuals. I researched each business online, looking for public information about their operations, their customer base, their financial situation, and any problems they might have that could make them vulnerable to blackmail. I cross-referenced the individual names with social media profiles, property records, and news articles to understand their personal circumstances and potential secrets. What I discovered was a carefully curated target list of people and businesses that all shared certain characteristics. They all had reputations that could be damaged by negative publicity. They all had information or resources that could be valuable to someone running a financial manipulation scheme. And they all had personal or professional vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone who knew how to identify and apply pressure to sensitive areas. The family restaurant that had been paying David Mitchell had recently been investigated for health code violations that had been quietly resolved without public disclosure. The dental practice had a partner who'd been through a messy divorce, involving questions about hidden assets. The accounting firm handled tax preparation for several prominent local families who valued discretion about their financial affairs. The individual victims showed similar patterns. One was a married city employee who'd been having an affair. Another was a small business owner who'd been cutting corners on tax reporting. A third was a community leader who'd been struggling with gambling addiction while maintaining a public image of family values and financial responsibility. Each target represented someone who would be willing to pay significant money to keep embarrassing or damaging information private. David had been systematically identifying people whose secrets could be monetized, then positioning himself to gain access to information that could be used against them. The method was diabolically clever because it relied on information that David could gather through normal social and professional interactions. He didn't need to break into offices or hack computer systems. He just needed to be charming and trustworthy enough that people would share personal details with him, then calculating enough to recognize how those details could be weaponized later. My investigation revealed that David had been using our relationship as his primary tool for target identification. The restaurant owner was someone we'd met at a neighborhood association meeting. The dental practice partner was the father of one of Jessica's co-workers.
The city employee was a member of my book club who'd confided in me about her marital problems during what I thought was a casual conversation between friends. David had been listening to my phone calls, reading my text messages, and mining my social connections for information about people who might be vulnerable to his operation. Every dinner party we'd hosted, every community event we'd attended together, every casual conversation I'd had with neighbors and coworkers had been intelligence gathering for his criminal enterprise. I felt physically sick as I realized how completely David had violated my trust and exploited my relationships. I'd been an unwitting scout for his blackmail operation, identifying targets and providing access without having any idea what he was planning to do with the information I was innocently sharing. But my disgust was quickly replaced by determination. If David had been using my social network to identify victims, then I could use those same connections to gather evidence against him. The people he'd been targeting knew me, trusted me, and would be more likely to cooperate with my investigation than with a formal law enforcement inquiry that might expose their secrets publicly. I decided to approach the victims directly, starting with the ones I knew personally. My book club friend Linda was the city employee who'd been paying David Mitchell $300 monthly for what she'd believed was help with personal financial planning. I called her and asked if we could meet for coffee to discuss something important but sensitive. Linda agreed to meet me at a small cafe downtown, away from our usual neighborhood spots where we might be overheard by mutual acquaintances. She looked nervous when she arrived, fidgeting with her purse and checking her phone repeatedly. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind me asking, but this isn't about David, is it? I heard about what happened with your wedding, and I'm so sorry, but I really can't get involved in any personal drama between you two." Her reaction told me everything I needed to know. Linda was afraid of what David might do if she talked to me, which meant he'd been using leverage against her that was significant enough to make her fear retaliation.
Linda, David has disappeared completely. He's not coming back and he can't hurt you anymore. But I need to understand what he was doing to people in our community, and I think you might have information that could help other victims. I explained what I'd discovered about David's secret business and false identity, showing Linda bank records that proved David Mitchell and David Morrison were the same person. I told her about Vivian Cross and the organized nature of the operation that had been targeting successful people across multiple states. Linda listened with growing shock and anger. When I finished, she was quiet for several minutes, processing the fact that someone she'd trusted with sensitive personal information had been systematically exploiting her for months. He knew about my affair, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how he found out, but about 8 months ago he contacted me and said he'd heard I was having some personal difficulties that might affect my job with the city if they became public knowledge. Linda described how David had approached her with an offer to help her manage the situation discreetly. He'd presented himself as someone who understood the complexities of maintaining professional reputation while dealing with personal problems. He'd offered financial planning services that would help her prepare for any career disruption that might result if her affair became known to her supervisors. The monthly payments were supposed to be for investment advice, Linda continued. David said he was helping me build a financial cushion that would give me flexibility if I needed to change jobs quickly. But looking back, I realized the money was just going into his accounts. There was never any actual investment plan. How did David know about your affair? I still don't understand that part. I'd been very careful about keeping it secret, but David knew details that only someone very close to the situation could have known. He knew where I'd been meeting my friend. He knew about hotel registrations and restaurant reservations. He even knew about text messages that I thought were completely private. Linda's description suggested that David had been conducting sophisticated surveillance on his targets, gathering information through methods that went far beyond casual social interaction. He'd been tracking her movements, monitoring her communications, and documenting her activities in ways that would have required technical skills and resources I hadn't known he possessed. Linda, this is exactly the kind of information law enforcement needs to build a case against David. Would you be willing to file a formal complaint and provide documentation of the payments you made to him? Linda was reluctant at first, worried about the affair becoming public if she cooperated with a criminal investigation. But when I explained that her cooperation might help protect other victims and prevent David from continuing his operation in whatever city he'd fled to, she agreed to work with Mike and the authorities. Over the next 2 weeks, I approached 4 more of David's victims using the same careful approach. Each conversation revealed additional details about David's methods and the scope of his operation. He'd been blackmailing the restaurant owner about health code violations that could have shut down the business permanently. He'd been extorting money from the dental practice partner by threatening to expose hidden assets that could have affected his divorce settlement. He'd been targeting the accounting firm with information about client tax irregularities that could have destroyed their professional reputation. In every case, David had positioned himself as a helpful consultant who could provide services to help manage sensitive situations. He presented the monthly payments as legitimate fees for financial planning, reputation management, or business consulting services. His victims had believed they were paying for professional help rather than being extorted for their silence. The sophistication of David's approach was remarkable. He'd created plausible business justifications for every payment, established professional relationships that made the transactions look legitimate, and maintained friendly personal connections that made his victims reluctant to suspect his true intentions. But his careful methodology had also created extensive documentation that could be used as evidence against him. Every monthly payment had been processed through official business accounts. Every consultation had been scheduled through professional email addresses. Every interaction had been conducted in ways that created digital and financial trails that law enforcement could follow. By the end of the month, I had collected statements from 6 victims, financial records showing over $40,000 in extortion payments, and testimony from Frank about David and Vivian's coordination of their criminal activities. Mike had worked with federal investigators to confirm that Vivian Cross was indeed part of a multi-state criminal network that had been operating under FBI surveillance for several months. The federal investigation had been focused on similar operations in California and Nevada, but they hadn't identified the Oregon and local connections until Mike shared our evidence with them. David and Vivian had been more successful at avoiding law enforcement attention than the other members of their network, but they'd also been more careless about leaving traces that could eventually be used against them. The FBI was particularly interested in David's surveillance capabilities and technical resources. The level of information he'd been able to gather about his victims suggested access to databases, monitoring equipment, or communication interception tools that indicated connections to more sophisticated criminal organizations. Agent Rebecca Martinez, the federal investigator assigned to our case, explained that David and Vivian's operation appeared to be a regional branch of a larger criminal enterprise that specialized in blackmail, identity theft, and financial manipulation targeting successful professionals and small business owners. Your ex-fiancé and his partner weren't just running a local scam, Agent Martinez told me during our first meeting. They were part of a network that's been operating across the western United States for at least 3 years. The evidence you've gathered fills in crucial gaps in our understanding of how they recruit targets and maintain long-term extortion relationships. Agent Martinez also confirmed that David and Vivian had fled to Mexico immediately after David's disappearance from our wedding. They'd been tracked to Tijuana, then to Mexico City, where they'd apparently connected with other members of their criminal network who were helping them establish new identities and relocate to a country without extradition agreements with the United States. The good news is that they took the money they'd stolen, which makes it easier for us to trace their movements and build criminal cases against them. The bad news is that recovering the stolen funds will be complicated and might take months or years of international legal cooperation. She explained that David and Vivian's escape plan had been more sophisticated than anyone initially realized. They hadn't just been preparing to flee with whatever money they could steal from their immediate victims. They'd been preparing to disappear into an established network of international criminals who specialized in helping financial manipulators avoid prosecution by relocating to jurisdictions where they could continue their operations without fear of arrest. The revelation that David had been part of an international criminal organization was both shocking and oddly comforting. It explained how he'd been able to maintain such sophisticated deceptions for so long without my detecting anything suspicious. He'd been trained by people who specialized in manipulation and fraud. His transformation from seemingly honest fiancé to calculating criminal hadn't been a sudden character change. It had been the result of professional criminal education that had taught him exactly how to maintain false identities while conducting illegal activities. But it also meant that David's betrayal of me had been even more calculated than I'd initially understood. He hadn't just decided to run away with another woman, he'd been recruited into a criminal organization that had trained him to use intimate relationships as cover for large-scale financial crimes. Our engagement, our wedding plans, our shared life together had all been part of a criminal strategy designed to provide him with social legitimacy while he systematically robbed and blackmailed our friends and neighbors. Agent Martinez assured me that federal prosecution would proceed even though David and Vivian had fled the country. The evidence we'd gathered was strong enough to support charges of wire fraud, money laundering, interstate criminal conspiracy, and multiple counts of extortion. International arrest warrants would be issued, and recovery of stolen funds would begin immediately. What you've done here is remarkable, Agent Martinez told me as our meeting concluded. Most victims of this kind of operation never realize what's happened to them, and the ones who do rarely have the resources or determination to gather the kind of evidence needed for prosecution. Your investigation saved us months of work and probably prevented David and his associates from victimizing dozens of additional people. But Agent Martinez also warned me that my investigation had attracted attention from other members of David and Vivian's criminal network. The FBI had intercepted communications suggesting that the organization was concerned about the exposure of their local operation and might attempt to intimidate witnesses or destroy evidence that could be used against other network members. We're going to recommend protective measures for you and the other victims who've cooperated with the investigation, she said. These people are sophisticated criminals with access to resources and connections that could make them dangerous to anyone who threatens their operations. The possibility that I might need protective custody was sobering, but it also confirmed something I'd suspected throughout my investigation. David's disappearance hadn't been the end of his criminal activities. It had been a strategic retreat designed to protect a larger operation that was still active and still targeting victims in other locations. By pursuing justice for what David had done to me and our community, I'd become a threat to an international criminal enterprise that had significant motivation to prevent me from continuing my efforts to expose their activities. The investigation that had started as personal heartbreak and betrayal had evolved into something much larger and more dangerous. But it had also revealed capabilities and resources within myself that I'd never known existed. I'd transformed from a naive woman who'd been manipulated by someone she trusted into a strategic thinker who'd systematically dismantled a sophisticated criminal operation. David had calculated that disappearing would protect him from the consequences of his crimes. Instead, his escape had activated an investigation that would eventually bring down not just him and Vivian, but potentially the entire criminal network they'd been working with. The man who'd abandoned me at the altar thinking I was too trusting and naive to pose any threat to his criminal enterprise had created an enemy who was far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. And I was just getting started. The phone call that changed everything came at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning, 3 months after David's disappearance. Agent Martinez's voice was tight with urgency when I answered, still groggy from sleep. "Sarah, we've located David and Vivian. They're in Costa Rica, and we have reason to believe they're planning to move again within the next 48 hours. But there's been a development that complicates the situation significantly." I sat up in bed, instantly alert. What kind of development? "David has been in contact with one of his former victims here. He's claiming that you've been stalking him, that you fabricated evidence against him out of revenge for your broken engagement, and that the FBI investigation is based on false information you provided." The audacity was breathtaking, even for David. After months of hiding in Central America with money he'd stolen from people who'd trusted him, he was now trying to position himself as the victim of my supposedly vindictive behavior. "He's also threatening to return to the United States voluntarily to clear his name," Agent Martinez continued. "Our analysts believe this is a manipulation tactic designed to muddy the waters and potentially intimidate witnesses before we can finalize the extradition process." Agent Martinez explained that David had been communicating with Linda, my book club friend, whom he'd been blackmailing about her affair. He'd somehow contacted her through encrypted messaging apps, claiming that he'd fled the country because I'd been making false accusations that had destroyed his reputation and threatened his safety. According to the messages we've intercepted, David is telling Linda that he never blackmailed anyone, that the consulting fees she paid were for legitimate financial planning services, and that you've manipulated law enforcement into believing a conspiracy theory about organized crime. The strategy was sophisticated and psychologically shrewd. David was exploiting Linda's existing guilt about her affair and her fear of public exposure by suggesting that cooperating with the FBI investigation would actually make her more vulnerable to the kind of vindictive behavior he was falsely attributing to me. Is Linda believing what he's telling her? She's confused and scared. David is very convincing, and he knows exactly which emotional buttons to push with each of his former victims. He's been contacting several of them with variations of the same story, trying to convince them that you're the real threat to their privacy and security. Agent Martinez arranged for me to meet with the federal prosecution team that afternoon to discuss how David's manipulation campaign might affect the criminal case. The prosecutors were confident that the evidence against David and Vivian was strong enough to withstand his attempts at character assassination, but they were concerned about the impact on victim cooperation and witness testimony. "The defense strategy is predictable," Assistant U.S. Attorney James Chen explained during our meeting. "They're going to claim that David was the victim of an elaborate frame-up orchestrated by a vindictive ex-fiancé with access to his personal information and financial accounts." Chen had prosecuted similar cases involving sophisticated financial criminals who attempted to discredit their accusers by claiming persecution or conspiracy. The approach was often effective because it exploited natural skepticism about scorned lovers seeking revenge through false accusations. "The key to defeating this strategy is demonstrating that your investigation was methodical, evidence-based, and independently corroborated by multiple sources," Chen continued. "We need to show that you didn't fabricate anything, that you discovered genuine crimes that were already in progress, and that your actions protected additional victims rather than creating false ones." Over the next week, I worked with the prosecution team to strengthen the evidence package by documenting every step of my investigation. We created a detailed timeline showing how each piece of evidence had been discovered, verified, and corroborated. We gathered testimony from Frank, the apartment building maintenance worker, confirming that he'd observed David and Vivian's activities independently of my investigation. We obtained bank records proving that David's fraudulent consulting business had been operating for months before his disappearance. Most importantly, we connected with federal investigations in other states that had independently identified David and Vivian as suspects in similar criminal operations. The evidence from California and Nevada showed that David's pattern of behavior had been consistent across multiple jurisdictions and predated his relationship with me by several years. David's defense strategy collapses when we demonstrate that he was engaged in identical criminal activities in other states where you had no presence or influence, Chen explained. The interstate evidence proves that this was an established criminal operation, not a personal vendetta disguised as law enforcement. But David's manipulation campaign was having its intended effect on some of his former victims. Linda called me 3 days later, her voice strained and uncertain. "Sarah, I need to ask you something directly. Did you know about David's consulting business while you were engaged to him? Is it possible that you were involved in any way and now you're trying to cover it up by blaming everything on him?" The questions hurt more than I'd expected, partly because they came from someone I'd considered a friend, but mostly because they revealed how effectively David was exploiting the shame and confusion his victims felt about being manipulated. "Linda, I discovered David's criminal activities the same way you're learning about them now, by finding evidence I never suspected existed," I replied. "If I'd known what he was doing, do you think I would have planned to marry him? Do you think I would have let him use our social connections to target people I care about?" Linda was quiet for a long moment. "I just don't understand how someone could hide something like this so completely. It makes me question everything I thought I knew about reading people, about trusting my own judgment." Her response illuminated something important about David's manipulation strategy. He wasn't just trying to discredit the evidence against him. He was exploiting the psychological vulnerability that victims of sophisticated manipulation often experience, the sense that being deceived so completely reflects some fundamental flaw in their judgment or character. "That's exactly what David is counting on," I told Linda. "He wants you to blame yourself for being victimized instead of holding him accountable for victimizing you. The more confused and self-doubting you feel, the less likely you are to pursue justice for what he did." I spent the next hour walking Linda through the evidence we'd gathered, showing her how David's operation had been designed specifically to exploit trusting people who had no reason to suspect criminal manipulation.
I explained that being deceived by someone with professional training in deception wasn't a personal failure. It was the predictable result of encountering someone whose entire skill set was built around making lies indistinguishable from truth. By the end of our conversation, Linda had regained her clarity about David's criminality and renewed her commitment to cooperating with the federal prosecution. But the call made me realize that David's defense strategy could be effective with other victims who lacked the detailed understanding of his methods that I'd developed through months of investigation. Agent Martinez confirmed my concerns when she called the next morning. David has succeeded in convincing 2 of his former victims to recant their statements to federal investigators. They're now claiming that they voluntarily paid for legitimate consulting services and that they were pressured by FBI agents to characterize those payments as extortion. The victims who'd changed their stories were people I didn't know personally, business owners who'd been targeted by David but hadn't been part of my social circle. Without the benefit of detailed conversations about David's methodology, they'd been more susceptible to his revised narrative about vindictive ex-fiancés and overzealous federal investigators. "This is why David decided to surface now," Agent Martinez continued. "He knew that victim testimony would be crucial to the federal case, and he calculated that he could undermine enough witnesses to create reasonable doubt about the charges against him. But David had made a strategic miscalculation that would ultimately destroy his defense strategy. By contacting his former victims directly, he'd violated federal laws about witness tampering and obstruction of justice. Every encrypted message he'd sent, every phone call he'd made, every attempt to influence witness testimony had been monitored by federal investigators who were now using his own manipulation efforts as additional evidence of his criminal intent. David thought he was clever by using encrypted communication apps, Agent Martinez explained. What he didn't realize is that we've been monitoring those apps since the beginning of our investigation into his criminal network.
Every attempt to influence witnesses has been recorded and will be used against him. The witness tampering evidence transformed the case from a financial fraud prosecution into something much more serious. David wasn't just facing charges for the crimes he'd committed before fleeing the country. He was now facing additional federal charges for attempting to obstruct justice and interfere with witness testimony from his hiding place in Costa Rica. 3 weeks later, Agent Martinez called with news that vindicated every hour I'd spent investigating David's disappearance. "We've arrested David and Vivian at the airport in San Jose. They were attempting to board a flight to Panama when Costa Rican authorities detained them at our request." The arrest had been coordinated through an international law enforcement operation that had been tracking David and Vivian's movements for months. The couple had become overconfident about their safety in Costa Rica, venturing into public spaces and using communication methods that had allowed investigators to pinpoint their location. More importantly, Agent Martinez continued, "We've recovered over $200,000 in stolen funds from accounts they'd been using to finance their time in hiding. The money will be returned to their victims as part of the restitution process." David and Vivian were being held in Costa Rican custody pending extradition to the United States, where they would face trial on multiple federal charges including wire fraud, money laundering, racketeering, and witness tampering. The evidence package I'd helped assemble would be central to the prosecution's case. But the most satisfying development was learning about David's reaction to his arrest. According to Costa Rican law enforcement officers who'd been present during the detention, David had initially attempted to claim diplomatic immunity, then tried to bribe the arresting officers, and finally demanded to speak with American embassy officials about what he characterized as political persecution by his vindictive ex-fiancé. His response to being arrested tells us everything we need to know about his character, Agent Martinez observed. Even when caught red-handed with evidence of his crimes, David's instinct is to blame other people and claim victimhood rather than accept responsibility for his actions. The extradition process took 6 weeks, during which time federal investigators continued building the criminal case by analyzing electronic devices and financial records that had been recovered during David and Vivian's arrest. The additional evidence revealed connections to criminal operations in Mexico, Panama, and Colombia that significantly expanded the scope of charges they would face. When David and Vivian finally arrived in federal custody, I was invited to observe their initial court appearance. Seeing David in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit was surreal after months of wondering whether he would ever face consequences for what he'd done. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by circumstances he could no longer control or manipulate. The confident charm that had made him so effective at deceiving victims and maintaining false relationships was completely absent. In its place was the petulant defensiveness of someone who couldn't understand why his sophisticated planning hadn't protected him from accountability. Vivian appeared more composed, but her expensive clothes had been replaced with standard jail attire, and her carefully maintained appearance showed signs of the stress she'd been experiencing since their arrest. She avoided eye contact with everyone in the courtroom, staring at her hands while the federal charges were read aloud. The list of charges took almost 10 minutes for the court clerk to complete. 37 counts of wire fraud, 18 counts of money laundering, multiple counts of racketeering conspiracy, 6 counts of witness tampering. The accumulated penalties for conviction on all charges would result in decades of federal prison time for both defendants. David's attorney, a public defender who'd been assigned to represent him after he claimed inability to afford private counsel, entered pleas of not guilty to all charges. But the defense strategy that emerged during subsequent hearings made it clear that David intended to continue blaming me for orchestrating his legal troubles. The government's case is built on the vindictive accusations of Miss Sarah Fleming, a woman whose personal relationship with my client ended badly, and who has demonstrated a pattern of obsessive behavior designed to destroy his reputation and freedom, David's attorney argued during a pre-trial hearing. The argument was demolished by Assistant U.S. Attorney Chen, who presented evidence showing that federal investigations into David and Vivian's criminal network had been initiated independently of my complaints, and had been corroborated by evidence from multiple states and international law enforcement agencies. Mr. Morrison's defense strategy requires the court to believe that Ms. Fleming somehow manipulated federal investigators in California, Nevada, Oregon, and Costa Rica into fabricating evidence against her ex-fiancé. Chen replied, "The implausibility of this conspiracy theory demonstrates the weakness of the defense case and the strength of the government's evidence." But the most devastating moment for David's defense came when Agent Martinez testified about the witness tampering charges. She played recordings of David's encrypted communications with his former victims, conversations that revealed his sophisticated understanding of manipulation techniques and his calculated efforts to undermine the federal investigation. The defendant's own words demonstrate that he understood the criminal nature of his activities and was attempting to prevent victims from cooperating with law enforcement. Agent Martinez testified. His efforts to contact witnesses from Costa Rica prove that he viewed the federal investigation as a legitimate threat to his freedom, not as persecution by a vindictive ex-partner. The trial lasted 3 weeks, during which time I testified about my discovery of David's secret life and my efforts to gather evidence about his criminal activities. David's attorney attempted to portray me as a bitter woman seeking revenge, but the strategy collapsed when prosecutors demonstrated that every piece of evidence I'd gathered had been independently verified and corroborated. The most powerful testimony came from David's victims, who described in detail how he'd systematically exploited their trust and vulnerabilities. Linda spoke about the fear and confusion she'd experienced when David threatened to expose her affair. The restaurant owner explained how David had used health code violations to extort monthly payments that had threatened the survival of his family business. Each victim's story followed the same pattern of manipulation and exploitation, creating an overwhelming portrait of systematic criminal behavior that couldn't be explained as personal revenge or vindictive prosecution. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against both David and Vivian. The courtroom was silent as the judge read 37 convictions for David and 32 for Vivian, followed by the announcement that sentencing would be scheduled for the following month. David's reaction to the verdict was everything I'd hoped to see and more than I'd dared to expect. For the first time since I'd known him, his carefully maintained composure completely collapsed. He began shouting accusations about prosecutorial misconduct and judicial bias, blaming everyone except himself for the consequences of choices he'd made systematically over months and years. Security officers had to restrain him as he demanded to represent himself in an appeal that would expose what he called the conspiracy against him. His meltdown continued until he was removed from the courtroom, still screaming about injustice and persecution while being led away in handcuffs. 2 weeks later, David was sentenced to 28 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. Vivian received 22 years for her role in the conspiracy. The judge ordered full restitution to all identified victims and additional penalties that would prevent them from profiting from their crimes even after their eventual release. Standing in that courtroom, watching David learn that he would spend the next 3 decades in prison, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction or revenge or even relief, but a profound sense of completion. The man who'd tried to destroy my life by abandoning me with lies about suicide had instead created the circumstances that revealed his true character and ensured he'd face justice for years of systematic criminality. David had calculated that disappearing would protect him from accountability. Instead, his escape had triggered an investigation that exposed an international criminal network and prevented countless additional victims from being exploited. His attempt to manipulate me through a fake suicide note had awakened capabilities and determination he'd never suspected I possessed. The coward who'd written about setting me free had instead freed dozens of current and future victims from his systematic exploitation. And in pursuing justice for what he'd done to me, I'd discovered strength and purpose that would define the rest of my life in ways he could never have imagined. 6 months after David's sentencing, I received an unexpected invitation that would change my perspective on everything I'd been through. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was hosting a conference on financial crimes and victim advocacy, and they wanted me to speak about my experience investigating and exposing organized fraud networks. Your case has become a model for how victims can effectively cooperate with law enforcement to dismantle sophisticated criminal operations, Agent Martinez explained when she called with the invitation. The techniques you developed for gathering evidence and identifying victims have been incorporated into our training materials for financial crime investigators. Standing at the podium in a room full of FBI agents, prosecutors, and victim advocates, I felt a sense of purpose I'd never experienced in my previous career. The story I told wasn't about heartbreak or betrayal anymore. It was about transformation, about discovering capabilities I'd never known I possessed, and about turning personal devastation into protection for others. The audience was particularly interested in my systematic approach to documenting David's criminal activities and building relationships with other victims. Several agents asked detailed questions about my methodology for approaching people who'd been manipulated by sophisticated criminals, and how I'd convinced them to cooperate with an investigation that required them to relive traumatic experiences. After my presentation, I was approached by Dr. Catherine Reeves, a criminal psychologist who specialized in fraud prevention and victim recovery. She offered me a position with her consulting firm, which worked with law enforcement agencies and financial institutions to develop strategies for identifying and preventing organized financial crimes. You have an intuitive understanding of how these criminal networks operate and how they exploit trust relationships, Dr. Reeves explained. That insight, combined with your investigative skills and your ability to connect with victims, makes you uniquely qualified to help us develop better prevention and response strategies. The career change felt like a natural evolution of everything I'd learned during my investigation into David's disappearance. Instead of marketing corporate products, I would be helping protect people from sophisticated predators who used the same manipulation techniques David had employed against me and our community. My first major project involved developing a training program for bank employees to help them identify suspicious account activities that might indicate organized fraud operations. The patterns I'd discovered in David's financial records became the foundation for detection algorithms that could flag accounts showing signs of systematic exploitation. The work was deeply satisfying in ways my previous career had never been. Every training session I conducted, every detection system I helped design, every case I consulted on represented potential protection for people who might otherwise become victims of criminals like David and Vivian. I also began working directly with fraud victims, helping them navigate the complex process of cooperating with law enforcement while protecting their privacy and emotional well-being. Many of them were dealing with the same feelings of shame and self-doubt that David had tried to exploit in his manipulation campaign, and I was able to use my own experience to help them understand that being deceived by professional criminals wasn't a personal failure. One of my first clients was a retired teacher named Margaret, who'd been targeted by a romance scammer using techniques similar to David's emotional manipulation methods. She'd lost her life savings to someone who'd spent months building what felt like a genuine relationship before gradually requesting financial assistance for fabricated emergencies. "I keep thinking I should have known," Margaret told me during our first meeting. "All my friends say the signs were obvious, that I was naive to believe someone I'd never met in person could really care about me." I recognized the self-blame that had been deliberately cultivated by her victimizer, the same psychological exploitation David had attempted to use against his blackmail victims. Margaret, the person who deceived you was a professional criminal with years of training in manipulation techniques. Expecting yourself to detect sophisticated deception is like expecting yourself to perform surgery without medical training. Working with victims like Margaret reinforced my understanding of how criminals like David operated and why traditional approaches to fraud prevention often failed. The problem wasn't that victims were gullible or careless. The problem was that criminals were becoming increasingly sophisticated in their ability to exploit normal human psychology and social behavior. 2 years after David's conviction, I received notification that he'd attempted to contact me through the federal prison system. Inmates were allowed to send letters to crime victims under certain circumstances, and David had apparently convinced prison administrators that he wanted to make amends for his actions. The letter, when it arrived, was exactly what I'd expected from someone who'd never accepted responsibility for his criminal behavior. David claimed he'd been suffering from mental health issues that had impaired his judgment during our relationship. He suggested that his crimes had been the result of psychological problems rather than deliberate criminal intent, and he implied that treatment programs available in prison were helping him understand and address the root causes of his behavior. The letter concluded with what appeared to be an apology but was actually another manipulation attempt. David wrote that he hoped I could find it in my heart to forgive him and perhaps even provide character testimony that might help with his eventual parole application. He claimed that knowing I'd forgiven him would help with his rehabilitation and his ability to make genuine amends to the people he'd harmed. I read the letter once, then filed it with the other case materials I kept for reference in my consulting work. David's attempt to reframe his systematic criminal enterprise as a mental health crisis was predictable, and his effort to recruit me as an advocate for his eventual release demonstrated that prison hadn't changed his fundamental approach to manipulating people. But I did write a response, not to David directly but to the prison officials who'd facilitated his contact with me. I provided them with a detailed summary of David's criminal activities, his pattern of manipulating victims through false emotional appeals, and my professional assessment that his letter represented continued criminal thinking rather than genuine rehabilitation. My letter included recommendations for enhanced monitoring of David's communications and restrictions on his ability to contact former victims or potential new targets. I also shared the letter with federal prosecutors, who used it as evidence of ongoing criminal behavior that would be relevant to any future parole considerations. 3 years after David's sentencing, the consulting firm I worked for was contracted to review the case files of his entire criminal network. The investigation that had started with my discovery of his fake suicide note had eventually led to the prosecution of 23 additional criminals across 6 states and 4 countries. The international scope of the network was staggering. David and Vivian had been relatively small operators in an organization that had been systematically targeting successful professionals for over a decade. The total amount of money stolen from victims exceeded $15 million, and the number of people whose lives had been disrupted by blackmail and manipulation was in the hundreds. But the most significant impact of the investigation was the development of new detection and prevention strategies that were now being used by financial institutions and law enforcement agencies worldwide. The patterns we'd identified in David's operation had become part of international databases used to track and intercept similar criminal activities. My role in exposing the network had evolved into a permanent position as a federal consultant specializing in organized fraud investigations. I worked with agencies across the country to train investigators in victim-centered approaches that prioritized protection and recovery while building strong criminal cases. The work took me to conferences and training sessions around the world, sharing the investigative techniques I'd developed and learning from other professionals who were fighting similar criminal networks. Each case I consulted on reinforced my understanding that what had happened to me wasn't unique or personal. It was part of a systematic problem that required coordinated professional response. 5 years after my wedding day that never happened, I was invited to speak at a victim advocacy conference where I met Linda, my former book club friend who'd been one of David's blackmail targets. She'd also transformed her experience into advocacy work, specializing in helping people recover from financial manipulation and rebuild their sense of personal security. "I never thanked you properly for helping me understand what really happened," Linda told me after my presentation. "When David contacted me from Costa Rica trying to convince me that you were the real problem, I almost believed him. But your patience in explaining his methodology helped me see that my confusion was exactly what he was trying to create." Linda had become a volunteer counselor with a nonprofit organization that provided support services to fraud victims. Her personal experience with sophisticated manipulation made her uniquely effective at helping other people recognize and recover from similar exploitation. "The strangest thing is that I'm grateful now for what happened," Linda continued. "Not grateful that David targeted me, but grateful that going through that experience led me to work that feels meaningful in ways my previous career never did." I understood exactly what she meant. The devastation of discovering David's betrayal had been the catalyst for personal and professional transformation I could never have anticipated. The skills I'd developed investigating his criminal activities had become the foundation for a career that protected other people from similar predators. Standing in that conference room, surrounded by advocates and investigators and survivors who'd all been shaped by their encounters with sophisticated criminals, I realized that David's attempt to destroy my life had actually created something much more valuable than the traditional future we'd planned together. The marriage I'd thought I wanted would have made me dependent on someone who was fundamentally dishonest and exploitative. The life we'd planned would have required me to remain naive about the criminal activities he was conducting in our community. The future he'd promised would have been built on systematic harm to people I cared about. By abandoning me with that fake suicide note, David had freed me to discover who I really was when faced with serious challenges. He'd forced me to develop investigative skills, strategic thinking, and emotional resilience that had transformed me into someone capable of protecting others from the kind of exploitation he represented. The coward who'd written about setting me free had done exactly that, just not in the way he'd intended. And every person I helped through my consulting work, every criminal network we disrupted, every victim who found justice was proof that his betrayal had ultimately created more protection and healing than destruction. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.